Hey class, we're doing our last video today before the Chapter 7 quiz. So just want to make sure that announcement comes out, that you're aware that we're closing up the chapter and we're having our quiz tomorrow. So make sure you study. I put some suggestions for study in the email that I sent out this morning that included the attachment or the link for this video. So we're going to finish up by talking about organizations and organizational structures. So let's just jump right in. First thing about organizations. Okay, so organizations are secondary groups. We talked yesterday in the live stream about primary versus secondary groups. And secondary groups are groups usually that are built around coming together for a specific purpose or to accomplish a specific task. And so organizations are built around that, usually accomplishing a specific task, which we'll dive into in a little bit. Also, they have a formal structure. So organizations are generally formalized. There can be informal structure to organizations, but the bigger the organization, the less effective that is. So usually organizations of any size, more than several people, have some kind of formal structure. And they're formed to accomplish a specific task, just like a secondary group. So examples of organizations that are really big, one example that your book gives is the NRA, right? It's got over 5 million members. It's a secondary group because the people, 5 million people aren't getting together on a regular basis. They do have conventions where smaller subsets of the group get together from time to time. However, it's a big organization. It's got a hierarchical structure, and it comes together for a particular goal or to accomplish a particular task. Brady campaign would be another one on the other side of that political issue that would be an organization. Okay, let's talk about organizational structure, and this is where bureaucracy comes into play. Bureaucracy, as your book defines it, is a hierarchical administrative structure with rules and procedures used to manage an organization. So if you have an organization, more than likely you have some kind of bureaucracy involved with the organization. So it's a hierarchical structure that is established, it's in place to try to help that organization run smoothly and effectively, to help it accomplish its goals. Because where there is no structure, usually things don't go all that well. How do you take a concern up the chain of command if there is no chain of command, right? Also, who's in charge of what subsets within the group? For example, who's in charge of paying employees if this is a for-profit, or even if it's a non-profit organization? Some people in non-profits still get paid. So who pays them? Well, that's where having a structure in place, a bureaucracy, is important. Or who fields employee concerns if it's an organization where there are employees? That would be where bureaucracy comes into play. Who casts vision for the organization, sets the direction the organization is going to go in? Well, again, that's where bureaucracy comes into play. So I want to talk about 4 traits of bureaucracy. So how do you know you have a bureaucracy, or what do you need to have in order to have a bureaucracy in place? First of all, in a bureaucracy, there's division of labor. So not everyone does the same thing in a bureaucracy. Tasks are broken down into smaller parts, and different departments or different people are in charge of those different parts, kind of like I talked about with payroll, for example. Or I have a couple of friends who are in charge of building operation. So anything that goes on from maintenance, repairs, anything like that, they oversee that, and they have to schedule out everything involved with that. So that would be part of division of labor, for example. So first part of a bureaucracy is division of labor. Second part 2, is a hierarchy of authority. So there's some kind of hierarchy. Someone's on top, and then there are varying levels depending upon how big the organization is. There are varying levels of degrees of authority within an organization. So if you're just an employee, you might be toward the bottom or at the bottom of the hierarchy. And then you may have like management, and then regional manager, right? And then you might have someone above them, like a VP or something like that, depending upon the organization. And lots of organizations have lots of different structures and levels of hierarchy, right? So if you're in a partnership, you might have like an administrative assistant, a junior partner, a senior partner, a CEO or a COO above them. But there's some kind of hierarchy of authority. Okay. Also, the third trait of a bureaucracy is impersonality. And this is one of the things that people often don't like about bureaucracies is that bureaucracies foster impersonality. Usually the smaller an organization is, the more personal it is. For example, if you've got a company with 10 people, people can call and be like, I want to talk to the owner. And guess what? You're going to get to talk to the owner in a small organization. But the bigger the bureaucracy, the more impersonal it tends to be. So if you or I, we call Apple, or let's say we call SpaceX even, that's someone harder to get a hold of, or we call Amazon. Let's call Amazon. So we call Amazon and we're like, hey, I want to talk to Jeff Bezos. The first question they're going to ask is, who are you? Right? Like, who do you think you are calling to talk to Jeff Bezos? It's going to take a lot of steps for you to be able to get through that chain and get to talk to Jeff Bezos. And odds are you're probably not going to get to talk to him, right? So it's very impersonal. And then it becomes like if you have a small organization, you can talk to the boss and oftentimes like the owner of that organization. And that person is the face of the organization. But the bigger it gets, the more it becomes less of a face of an organization. It just is, right? When we think of Amazon, a lot of people don't think of Bezos. They think of the trademark Amazon or the name, or they think Amazon Prime or other things about the company. It's less personal. It's just the organization becomes its own thing instead of the person or people behind it, or even employees that are a part of it. So that's the third trait. And then the fourth trait of a bureaucracy is it has written rules and records. A bureaucracy probably has a handbook, which is a set of rules that employees need to follow. It may have a handbook for employers. It may have some kind of corporate charter or rules that the corporation has to follow as well. So it's got written rules that need to be followed. And there's record keeping involved with that as well. Not just, there can be financial record keeping, but there's other record keeping involved in organizations as well. It could be like annual reviews, or if there are punitive measures taken against someone that's a member of the organization, like write-ups, things like that. That would be record keeping as well. So those are the four traits of a bureaucracy. Make sure you're very familiar with those. So a bureaucracy, it's a hierarchical administrative structure. It's got rules and procedures, and the four traits: division of labor, hierarchy of authority, impersonality, and written records and rules. Okay, now another thing just to talk about in organizations is the idea of power. Your book highlights power a lot, and power does play a major role in social interactions and in the sociological sphere. So one thing that your book highlights is the idea of in-groups and out-groups. So I just want to make sure I touch on that. So if you think of it, it seems very intuitive to think about. Like an in-group is a group that a member, or even someone who's not a member but an outsider, looks on and feels positively about. Either they look positively on whatever that organization is, or whatever that group is, or if they're a member, they feel good about being a member of that group. So the out group would be the reverse, and it's usually a group where outsiders look in on the group and they feel negatively about that group, or they have some kind of negative association with that group. So if we're back to, since your book mentioned the NRA as an organization, if you're on the anti-gun side on the political fence and you look at the NRA, you would probably look at the NRA as an out group. You probably wouldn't feel very good about it, right? But if you're on the NRA's side of the argument and you look at the Brady campaign or Moms Demand Action, you would probably look at them as an out group. And if you belong to either of those organizations, whichever one you support, you would look at those as in groups. All right, and it doesn't have to be such a formalized organization for in groups and out groups. But generally, the case your book is going to make is uh, the more people that view a group as an in-group, the more power that group is going to have, right? Because there's generally power in numbers. Not always, right? There's a lot to be said for organization and for zeal in promoting one's organization, which is how a lot of times small grassroots movements become big movements, is because they're made of a small group of people that feel very strongly and are very vocal, and turn their out-group into an in-group. Okay, last two things to talk about are conformity and obedience. Within a group, there's often conformity among group members. If you're in a group, it's very unlikely that an individual within a group is going to be nonconformist or is going to speak out against the actions of a group while still being in the in-group, while still considering themselves a part of the group. Now, this does happen, but there is a tendency for groupthink to occur, right? So being in the echo chamber, if you will, because we tend to, as we learned in a previous lesson on this chapter, we tend to, as people, surround ourselves with individuals who think like us, right? And even not just think like us, we tend to surround ourselves with people that are in similar states of life. That can be age groups, it can be socioeconomic groups, but we tend to surround ourselves with like people. And so that further leads to conformity when we surround ourselves with people who think like us, so it just reinforces our mindset. So whatever we think, if we just hear the same thing repeated over and over again, we tend to see that as reality or have a normalcy bias toward that. So in a group, there tends to be conformity, and people tend to feel social pressure to not speak out or to contradict something that's being said or an idea that's being promoted in a group. Also, just a phenomenon socially would be obedience. People seem to be programmed or have an innate desire to obey those in authority. Your book points out the Milgram experiments and then further experiments that were based on the Milgram experiments, where someone who seemed like someone in authority told an individual in the Milgram experiments to administer a shock to a patient. And even when the shock seemed to the individual to be lethal or potentially lethal, when the person in authority said, no, it's okay, they tended to comply. Right? So think about that. If someone that appears to be in authority tells you to do something that you don't feel comfortable doing, more than likely what the Milgram and other experiments based on the Milgram experiment teaches us that people will tend to comply with those in authority, even when they don't feel necessarily right about it. There's this desire to not go against those in authority, which can serve a good purpose at times when people, like, for example, no one likes to get surgery. I don't think anyone's really excited about surgery. But when a physician tells you, hey, I know you don't want to have this done, but you need to have it done or further complications are going to arise, we tend to trust that person in authority, and that tends to be beneficial. Now we can parse out the minutiae, medical errors and things like that. But generally, that person in authority giving us a helpful push is a good thing. But there are also instances where people in authority giving a push can be a bad thing, and people tend to not listen to that voice of their conscience because of this idea of obeying and just almost this innate desire for obedience. Another example I saw of this, and it really struck me, is in Punxsutawney on Groundhog's Day, there are some men in top hats and suits, and 40,000 people gathered to see Punxsutawney Phil, and they actually behaved quite well because they were very eager to obey the men in the top hats, who were those as seen in authority. So the reason that there wasn't pandemonium was because there was the appearance of authority, and those who were recognized as the authorities on that occasion were obeyed. Now, if a random man in a top hat and a suit told you to do something any other time, you probably wouldn't listen to them. But because they were the perceived authority at that moment, 40,000 people did what they were told. So we have this idea and this desire to obey those in authority generally. Now, we can talk about anti-authoritarianism or counterculture or protest, but by and large, people tend to obey those in authority. All right, so Thank you guys for all the good work you've been doing over the past week, a little bit more than the past week with this distance learning. You guys have been doing a really good job. I just want to encourage you and keep up the good work. If you have any questions, email me anytime. Okay, guys? Until next time.